It was the summer of 2009 when I first heard about it. I had just started a road trip across the United States with some friends, eager to explore the open highways, visit old towns, and, like every road traveler, collect strange stories. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. We were driving through rural Pennsylvania, somewhere in the heart of nowhere. The road stretched endlessly before us, surrounded by thick woods and fields that seemed to never end. We had been driving for hours, and the moonlight barely broke through the trees, casting everything in a ghostly glow. The air was thick and still, as if the world had fallen into some kind of eerie silence. We passed a small town, or what was left of it. The sign said, Hollow Creek, but the only thing there were a few dilapidated houses and an old gas station with broken windows. We didn't stop. We were in a hurry to reach our next destination, and no one felt like dealing with an old, run-down town in the middle of nowhere. As we continued on the road, the atmosphere felt strange, like something was watching us from the trees. It was about 2 in the morning when we saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, a young woman standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, hitchhiking. She was dressed in a white dress that seemed out of place, especially on a dark, lonely highway. Her hair was long and unkempt, and her bare feet were dirty, as if she had been walking for days. At first, we debated whether we should stop. It felt odd. This was the kind of area where you wouldn't expect anyone to be out, especially someone in that condition. But there she was, standing in the shadows, her face almost impossible to make out under the pale moonlight. She didn't seem threatening. In fact, she looked tired, almost desperate. "Should we pick her up?" my friend Tom asked, glancing at me from the driver's seat. I hesitated. Something in the pit of my stomach told me not to stop, but I couldn't explain why. "She doesn't look like she's in danger. Maybe she's lost," I said, trying to justify the decision. We had been raised to help others when we could, right? Against my better judgment, we slowed down and rolled the window down a crack. The woman didn't say a word, just looked at us as we approached, her eyes shadowed by the darkness. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before answering. Just to the next town," she replied in a soft, almost haunting voice. "Can you take me there?" We nodded and, after a brief pause, she climbed into the back seat. She didn't speak again, and the air inside the car grew tense. No one knew what to say. We kept driving, the headlights cutting through the night as the trees on either side pressed in closer, their dark shadows almost suffocating. After about 20 minutes of silence, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see if she was still there. She was. But then, just as quickly as I noticed her, I felt my heart drop. There was something off about her reflection. She was sitting in the back seat, but her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, they didn't look like they had any life behind them. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. "Are you okay back there?" I asked nervously. She didn't respond. I turned to Tom, who was driving, but when I looked back at the rearview mirror, the seat was empty. I froze, my pulse racing. The back seat was completely empty. There was no trace of the woman. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom's eyes widened. "What? What do you mean?" "There's no one back there, man." I quickly turned around, but the seat was as empty as it had been when we first picked her up. We pulled over to the side of the road, my mind spinning. We sat there in stunned silence, not knowing what to say or do. Tom and I were both trying to process what had just happened. We had clearly seen her in the back seat, but now there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. We eventually continued on, trying to convince ourselves it had been some sort of trick of the mind or an illusion. But the sense of dread never left us. The next morning, we stopped at a gas station near the town we were heading to. It was the first place we saw with a light on. I went inside to buy a coffee and asked the cashier about the woman we had picked up the night before. "Did you happen to see a hitchhiker around here last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The cashier gave me a strange look, then shook his head. "You're not the first one to ask about her," he said. "People around here have been talking about her for years. They say she was the daughter of a local family who died in a car crash over 20 years ago. Some folks say they still see her out on that road at night, trying to hitch a ride to wherever she's headed." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Is she real?" The cashier looked at me with a grim expression. "I've heard the story so many times. People say she's still out there, waiting for someone to take her home. But no one knows where that home is. I don't know if what we saw that night was a ghost or something else entirely, but the experience haunted me long after. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had unknowingly picked up someone who wasn't supposed to be there. It was as if the road itself had conjured her up, somehow, and to this day, if you happen to be traveling through the rural roads of Pennsylvania, and if you see a lone woman in a white dress standing by the side of the road at night, hitchhiking, don't stop. It's better to keep driving and never look back, because sometimes, when you pick up a stranger, you might not be giving them a ride. You might just be taking them home." When I first began my research into paranormal phenomena, I found myself fascinated by stories about old, forgotten roads, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly through remote landscapes. People said that on these roads, time moves differently, as if the place itself exists in a kind of limbo, a meeting point between the real world and something darker. But there's one road in particular that remains burned into my memory. It's a road I should have never taken. It was 2011, and I was traveling through rural Montana, looking for material for a book on ghost stories. The locals spoke in hushed tones about a forgotten road that stretched between two tiny, isolated towns. It wasn't on any map, and no one seemed to be able to explain it. The road itself was narrow, with no signs, barely a path. Most importantly, they warned me not to drive it after dark. But being the curious writer I was, I ignored their advice. After all, nothing seemed more enticing than a story waiting to be discovered. I entered the road around twilight. The air was thick with fog, so dense that the headlights of my car barely pierced it. The trees on either side seemed to close in around me, as if the road were being swallowed by the forest itself. I didn't think much of it, just another rural road, I told myself, but there was something unsettling about the way the fog clung to everything. It felt alive. After a few miles, I came upon a car parked at the side of the road. It was strange. There were no other vehicles out here, and this car seemed abandoned, dark and still, the engine off. At first, I thought it was just another ghost of the road, but then I noticed a man standing beside it. He waved to me as I slowed down. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his face partially obscured by a dark cap. I stopped my car, rolling down the window. "Hey there, could you help me out?" he called in a rough but friendly voice. "My car broke down, and my phone's dead. Could you get me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated. There was something about his request that felt off, but I dismissed the thought. I was alone on a deserted road. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I agreed, and he climbed into the passenger seat without a second word. The ride was silent at first. I tried to make small talk, but he only responded with short answers. He seemed distant, almost detached, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The fog continued to grow thicker, and it became harder to see ahead, as if the road itself was closing in on me. "Did you know this road is cursed?" he suddenly asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, surprised. "Cursed?" He grinned a little, but there was something unsettling in his smile. "Yeah. People don't talk about it much, but it's true. It's not a safe place for anyone. Some say if you travel down it at night, something watches you." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss his words as another local legend. "What do you mean, watches you?" His smile faded, and he leaned in a little closer. "Some travelers don't make it out. They disappear. And if you're not careful, you might join them." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was an edge to his voice now, something that made my heart race. But before I could respond, He looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as if he were staring into the fog. I glanced at the road ahead, but it was just more of the same, endless, empty road shrouded in mist. Then, he turned to me, his expression suddenly more serious. "You shouldn't be driving here," he said quietly. "You should stop." I shook my head, feeling my stomach twist with unease. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window again, then back at me. "You're not alone." "Not really. Something's already following us." I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind us, just the same endless fog. "What are you talking about?" "Turn around. Go back. It's not too late." But by then, the road had narrowed, and I was driving deeper into the forest. It seemed like no matter which way I turned, the road kept stretching further and further into the mist. There were no signs of civilization, no lights, nothing. It was as if the world had fallen away, leaving just me and this eerie, suffocating fog. I glanced over at the passenger seat, but he was gone. Completely gone. My heart pounded as I slammed my foot on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The car was empty. No man, no sign of him, just the empty seat. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. What the hell was going on? I looked out the windshield. The fog had grown so thick that I couldn't see a foot ahead. Then I heard it. The sound. A soft scraping noise, as if something was dragging itself across the road. Slowly, almost deliberately. I held my breath, straining to hear over the thudding of my heart in my chest. The sound got louder, closer. I glanced into the rearview mirror. A figure stood behind me, just at the edge of the fog. It was pale, its features obscured by the mist, but I could see the outline of a person. It was standing still, watching me. My pulse quickened. Suddenly, I slammed the gas pedal down, swerving the car wildly to try to outrun whatever it was. But the fog seemed to close in tighter, and every time I tried to steer the car, the road just stretched out endlessly, turning back in on itself. The figure was still there, always just behind me, never closer, but never farther, and then it was gone. Just as suddenly as it had appeared. The fog lifted, and I found myself back on a road I recognized. The familiar, winding path leading toward the town. It was as if nothing had happened. I stopped the car. My hands were shaking. I couldn't breathe. The man, the passenger, was gone. And I never found that road again. I tried to tell people about what happened that night, but no one believed me. I asked around for the road, trying to find it again, but no one knew what I was talking about. To this day, I have no explanation. I know I saw something that night. Something that wasn't human. Something that was waiting for me. If you ever find yourself driving down an old, forgotten road in the middle of nowhere, and if the fog gets too thick, and if you see someone standing beside the road, don't stop. Whatever it is, it's not alone, and if you let it in, it will never let you go. It happened a few years ago, in the fall of 2015. I was working late one night at a small, quiet office building on the edge of town. Nothing too exciting, just the usual office work, a few reports to finish. By the time I finally wrapped up, it was past midnight. The building was empty, and the silence around me felt almost unnatural. I usually walked home, it wasn't too far, but that night, the air felt colder than usual, and I decided to take a cab instead. After leaving through the back door and walking across the deserted parking lot, I saw a taxi waiting by the curb. The driver waved, as if he'd been expecting me, even though I hadn't called for a ride. "Where to?" the driver asked in a gravelly voice as I climbed in. "Just take me home, please," I said, trying to shake off the unease that was settling in my stomach. As the taxi pulled away from the building, I noticed something strange. The streetlights along the road seemed unusually dim, and the buildings on either side were quiet. Too quiet. I've lived in that area for years, and I knew it well. There was always noise, cars, people, dogs barking, the usual sounds of a neighborhood at night. But that night, it felt like the world had gone still. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but my eyes kept drifting back to the rearview mirror. The driver's face was barely visible, just the outline of his features, lit by the faint light from the street. He was wearing a black cap and an old jacket, nothing too unusual, but something about his posture seemed off. He was sitting too still, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Been working long?" I asked, hoping to break the silence. He didn't respond right away. The pause was unnerving. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Long enough." His voice was low, almost muffled, as if he were speaking from far away. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at his face. His eyes met mine briefly, and something about them made me feel uneasy. They were too dark, almost black, and there was something cold, empty in his gaze. It made my heart skip a beat, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The ride continued in silence. The city seemed to dissolve around us as we passed through darker, quieter streets. The further we went, the more I felt like we were leaving everything behind. There were no more houses, no more signs of life, just long, empty stretches of road. Finally I asked, "Hey, are we on the right route? I usually take the main road through the park." The driver didn't respond immediately. I tried again. "Hello?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. The expression was almost unreadable. "This is the quickest way," he said, his voice still muffled, like he was speaking through a thick fog. I didn't press him further. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt like something wasn't right, like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The world outside the window had become darker, the houses less frequent. The quiet was so thick I could almost feel it pressing in on me. And then, just as the cab made a sharp turn onto a narrow road, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure appeared at the side of the road, walking slowly in the dark. A woman. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, and her hair was hidden by a hood. She was walking slowly, deliberately, almost as if she were waiting for the cab to pass. I leaned forward in the seat, trying to get a better look at her. The street lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the road. And then, before I could even react, the driver did something unexpected. He slowed down. "Are you stopping?" I asked, confused. "You're not supposed to stop out here." The driver didn't say a word. He didn't even glance at me. He just kept his hands on the wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. But his foot stayed on the brake, slowing us down, almost to a crawl. The woman, still walking, seemed to be getting closer. I could see her now. Her steps were unsteady, almost like she was dragging her feet. Her face was obscured by the hood, but I could make out something about the way she moved, like she wasn't entirely in control of her own body. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Why are we stopping?" I demanded, my voice rising. This isn't safe." But the driver didn't answer. He didn't even react. I looked back at the woman again. She was standing in the middle of the road now, right in front of the cab. Her face was still hidden, but I could feel her presence. It was as if she were drawing closer, but at the same time, staying impossibly far away. Her form seemed to blur at the edges, like she was fading in and out of reality. "Please go!" I shouted. "We need to leave now." Without warning, the driver's head jerked toward me, and for the first time, I saw his eyes clearly in the mirror. They were wide, unblinking. His pupils were unnaturally large, almost taking up the entire space of his eyes. "Do you see her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, shaking as though he were trying to convince himself of something. "Who?" I stammered. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The woman was gone, just like that. She wasn't standing in the road anymore. She wasn't in the rearview mirror. There was no sign of her. The cab driver, still staring ahead, quickly pressed the accelerator, the car jerking forward and speeding up like nothing had happened. I was in shock, not knowing what to think. The fear had settled deep in my chest, and I could barely breathe. What was that? Where did she go? I asked, my voice trembling. The driver glanced at me again, his lips twitching into a grim, almost pitying smile. You shouldn't have asked about her, he said, his voice low, almost detached. What do you mean? What are you talking about? I asked, now panicking. I had to get out of this cab, but I couldn't. I didn't even know where we were anymore. It felt like the world had shifted, and we were driving in some other place, some other dimension. You'll see, he said, and there was something in his voice, something cold, like he knew something I didn't. You'll see. And then, just as we turned another corner, the streetlights flickered one last time, and I looked out the window. I didn't know where we were, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I don't remember how I got home that night. I don't remember when the taxi stopped, or if I even paid him. All I remember is that the next morning, when I looked out my window, I saw a police car parked at the corner of my street. It was the same area where I had been picked up, and they were investigating the area around the spot where I'd seen that woman. The police never found anything, but I know what I saw. And I know that sometimes, the people you meet on the road aren't really there to give you a ride. Some are there to take you somewhere else entirely.